Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to this week's Geary seminar. I'm delighted to welcome Egle and Gusciute from the School of Sociology. Egle is an assistant professor, and she has research interests in a number of areas, including environmental sociology, sociology in sport, and migration. And it's migration that she will address today. And her interests in migration centre on ethnic minorities, discrimination, anti-immigrant sentiment, migration, integration, and citizenship. So today, Egle is going to talk to us about work that has been done on a field experiment in the rental housing market, so examining ethnic discrimination against refugees in Ireland, and particularly looking at Ukrainian refugees. So before starting the seminar, phones to silent, mind your lunch, and I'll hand over to Egle. Thank you.
So today I'll be talking about a kind of ongoing research. So this is a field experiment that's still ongoing. I feel like I'll never finish it, so sometimes I wonder why I started it in the first place. But it's kind of a second experiment of this type that I've done. So I'm going to talk about first a little bit about background motivation and the first experiment that I carried out back in 2018, and then kind of how this then fits in with that, with the, I suppose, the current experiment fits in with the previous one. So some background motivation. I suppose migration and particularly integration of ethnic minorities is a key research interest of mine, and I think something like housing is particularly important to look at. Obviously, housing is a fundamental right. Everyone needs access to housing. Access to housing is also linked to better well-being, various health outcomes, employment opportunities, educational opportunities. So obviously, it's very important. And access to housing is protected by various legislative instruments within the European context, but also within the Irish context. For example, the Equal Status Act 2000-2015 prohibits discrimination in accessing services, which includes accommodation on 9 grounds, and one of those grounds is ethnicity. However, despite it being recognised as a fundamental human right, and despite legislative protections, all the evidence that we have in the existing literature points that there is significant prevalence of ethnic discrimination in accessing housing. A lot of studies similar studies which have looked at ethnic discrimination in housing markets use what is known as correspondence studies. So correspondence studies generally involve creating either sending written documents such as CVs or emails to prospective landlords or employers, and changing the name of the prospective applicant, trying to measure direct rate of discrimination. The two studies cited here, Flage and Osberg, they're meta-analyses which have shown significant evidence of ethnic discrimination, but I'm yet to find one study in any context which has shown that there's no ethnic discrimination, particularly in the housing market. It's important to note that the rate of discrimination does vary depending on ethnicity. So for example, in the European context, generally ethnic minorities or migrants who are seen as more similar to the let's say the native, so to speak, group tend to be less discriminated against than ethnic minorities which are seen as very distinct. So this could be based on their nationality, on their ethnicity, as well as religion. So for example, Muslim applicants in particular tend to be discriminated to a significant degree. Gender tends to play a role as well. So for example, males tend to be discriminated to a greater extent than females. But we know from existing evidence that ethnic discrimination is prevalent in many countries. So moving on to the Irish context, when I first carried out the experiment in 2018, there was only one experiment which was in the labour market, so carried out by McGinnity and Lunn and colleagues at the Economic and Social Research Institute, which showed discrimination in the labour market. So I was very interested to look at the housing market in particular and kind of compare it to existing literature within the European context to see are there any differences. I would argue that housing can be considered a scarce resource in the Irish context, so there's a lot of demand for housing and obviously not enough supply, and this is the same in the private and public, or in the, I suppose, rental, and if you're trying to purchase accommodation or rent accommodation, but I'm specifically focusing on the rental market. In addition, migrants are more likely to be concentrated in the rental sector. So therefore, if there is ethnic discrimination in the rental sector, they're more likely to be impacted by this, let's say, than the native population. And we also know from studies carried out in Irish context that there is evidence of ethnic hierarchy. So for example, a qualitative study by Byrne showed that who is considered a migrant can really vary depending on their nationality, ethnicity, and so on. So in Byrne's study, for example, she found that Irish working professionals don't consider migrants from Australia or North America as migrants. However, migrants coming, for example, from Eastern Europe, or migrants who are seen as non-European or outside of, let's say, the likes of North America or Australia, are seen as migrants. So she talks about this idea that there's this kind of ethnic hierarchy who is considered to be a migrant. Studies by the various studies carried out at the Economic and Social Research Institute as well have shown that attitudes towards migrants vary depending on, again, ethnicity, religion, and that can really influence public perception of, I suppose, how migrants are received. So I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. So I'm very briefly going to talk about the experiment that I carried out in 2018 with Richard Late and Peter Mulau, just to kind of give you some context, but also, to, as I said, to later situate the current experiment in it. So the experiment in 2018 was based on previous experiments carried out in European context, so using the same methodology, correspondence studies, as well as the Irish labour market experiment carried out by McGinnity. Basically what we did is we created 6 fictitious applicants and signaled their ethnicity using names. So we carried out a pilot study to test the names, and we focused on Irish, Polish and Nigerian applicants. The reason Polish and Nigerian applicants were chosen is because Polish applicants represent the largest migrant, or certainly in 2018 were the largest migrant group. You'd argue that, you know, they'd be generally perceived to be European, white, most likely Catholic. We wanted to compare them to a distinct group, so we specifically focused on Nigerian applicants because they represent a significant African population in Ireland, but also would predominantly be seen as non-white and non-European. We focused on the Greater Dublin area and applied for only new ads in that area between May and November 2018. And each apartment was applied to 3 times, stratified by gender and employment. We focused on finance, accounting and IT. At the time, they were sectors that had significant number of vacancies, so it was likely that people could be working in those sectors, but also had high enough salaries that someone would be able to rent a full, let's say, apartment by themselves working in those sectors. And we used 3 equivalent but not identical templates. And just some results. So these are from logistic regression models, but don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with tables of logistic regressions. So just focusing on odds for ethnic minority applicants, so our reference category are the Irish applicants. So in comparison to the Irish applicant, the odds of being invited to view an apartment decreased by 24% for Polish applicants and decreased by 54% for Nigerian applicants. So these are obviously significant enough numbers if you're looking for accommodation, and not very good odds obviously in your favour. We also then compared differences between ethnic minority groups. So now in comparison to the Polish applicant, comparing Nigerian applicants, the odds for Nigerian applicants reduced by 39%. So that means that we find in the 2018 experiment, we find not only evidence of ethnic discrimination in general in the Irish market, but that there also is this ethnic hierarchy. So yes, Polish applicants were also discriminated against, but to a lesser extent in comparison to the Nigerian applicants. And in line, I suppose, with existing literature, we also did find gender differences. So male applicants were less likely to be invited by 22% in comparison to female applicants, and this holds across ethnic groups. So that's to say, the Irish male applicant is less likely to be invited than the Irish female, the Polish male is less likely to be invited than the Polish female, and so on. And it was particularly I suppose from a policy perspective, one thing to specifically note is that the Nigerian male was particularly significantly disadvantaged, particularly in comparison to, for example, the Irish female applicant. And we already know that Nigerian nationals are likely to experience significant levels of discrimination in Ireland, but this experiment really shows that if we kind of intersect ethnicity and gender, it can really lead to significant discrimination. In terms of other findings as well, which I suppose were relevant from that experiment, were that Irish applicants were also more likely to receive preferential treatment. So this preferential treatment would relate to, for example, being given better viewing times or giving a choice of viewing times, being much more accommodating. For example, if an accommodation was gone, the landlord or estate agent might suggest a different accommodation that they had. The emails were generally longer and more polite. And in terms of gender differences as well, which was kind of more from, I suppose, a qualitative perspective, interesting to note is that, so in this experiment, people were applying as a single applicant for the entire accommodation. Despite the fact that some of these accommodations were smallest studios that you could barely fit one person, women were more likely to be asked, statistically more likely to be asked if they were renting alone, if they had a partner and or children. Whereas men were often asked to provide lifestyle and character references. These were sort of vague. I still don't really know what these were supposed to look like. So in addition to your employer references, some lifestyle character reference was also required. So kind of these more nuanced gendered stereotypes were being applied. So that's the 2018 experiment. So kind of moving on to the current context and the current experiment. So when I was carrying this experiment as part of my PhD work back in 2018, I really thought the housing market was shocking and it was really bad. So why I decided to do this experiment again when the market was much worse, I really don't know. Bad judgment call maybe. But I do think it's important to note that if you focus on the green, just the green line, the stock of housing available to rent on Daft, this is the say 2018, you can really see that it continues to drop and it's at an all-time low. And when I first started the current experiment, I really thought I would have it kind of done relatively quickly. But the availability of the housing means that the experiment has been going on for a lot longer than I would like, because you have to obviously avoid detection and try to not, and there just aren't that many properties. So just to give you an example, for example, about, let's say, a month ago in Dublin, on the given day, there were maybe less than 100 available properties, and I'm talking about like the whole Dublin area. And if you're a person obviously looking for accommodation, you're not going to be looking in the entire Dublin area. So the stock is really low. In addition to that, I suppose, on the other hand, we've got increasing migration. So we have, again, if we focus on the black line here, that's net migration. So you've got the drop during the recession. The slight drop here, it's due to COVID, but then it's been obviously on the increase again. So that means more people some of these obviously could be returning Irish nationals, some of these could be migrants, but basically placing greater potential, I suppose, greater demand on the housing market. So obviously not helping with the lack of accommodation. We've also had an increase in applications for international protection, which obviously is quite important as well. I do think it's always important to note, particularly maybe for anyone who isn't familiar with refugee studies, that while the numbers have increased significantly in the Irish context, these numbers are very low in comparison to the other European countries. So I do think it's important to note, because I think people often think that these are really high. They're actually extremely low if we compare them to some other European countries. But I do think what's interesting to note is that this is the refugee crisis. So Ireland had a slight increase, but relatively low. But then since then, we've actually gotten a significant increase in applications for international protection, which is important to note, because obviously that has pressure on the existing direct provision system. And for anyone who might be granted refugee status and is trying to leave direct provision system, that can be really hard then to find accommodation if they are sort of almost forced out into the private market. And we also have an increase in Ukrainian nationals coming since obviously the Ukraine crisis, which is just using PVSN registrations, and that has been obviously increasing in the period 22 to 23 as well. In terms of, I suppose, in the current experiment, how I'm phrasing it, so for example, why would one discriminate towards, for example, refugees or migrants? Often theories that are put forward in relation to this relate to statistical discrimination and taste-based discrimination. obviously some people might disagree, maybe particularly economists, but I would argue that these are very almost the same theory, but showing itself slightly something else. So statistical discrimination kind of assumes that the person making the decision perhaps has imperfect or doesn't have enough information about the applicant, and therefore will apply stereotypical information about the overall group that the applicant might belong to that particular individual. Taste-based discrimination relates more on xenophobic, racist views, why someone might discriminate. I do think that they overlap. Other studies have also shown that in-group favoritism, for example, has a role to play. So people are more likely to allocate resources to their own in-group. So when it comes to employment, when housing, you're more likely, for example, to give a job to perhaps someone who's from the same ethnic group as that you belong to, rather than, let's say, other ethnic groups. And that there's also this hierarchy of acceptance towards different ethnic groups. So kind of social distance comes into play, where migrants, again, are more likely to be seen differently based on their ethnicity. So migrants who are more similar to one's own native group are more likely to be seen closer. And therefore, there's this kind of hierarchy. Any migrant who's seen as more different, whether ethnicity, religion, or other factors might come to play, they're kind of seen as more, I suppose, further removed from the native group. And public attitude research as well shows that when there is an increase in size of a subpopulation and some economic concerns, greater discrimination, more hostile attitudes are likely to follow. So let's say in the case of Ukrainian nationals in Ireland, we could argue that housing is a scarce resource, there's a housing crisis, there's this sudden increase in the subpopulation. Therefore, if there are sort of xenophobic views, they're more likely to be discriminated against than, let's say, Irish nationals. However, Ukrainian nationals are also quite an interesting group to look at from migration studies, because there has been much greater solidarity shown towards this particular group of migrants. Studies have shown that public attitudes are much more positive towards Ukrainian nationals than they have been towards other migrant groups or other refugees in previous crises. There are differences in media framing. So, for example, the media have framed the Ukraine crisis and Ukrainian nationals very differently to the way they framed, for example, the 2015 refugee crisis. They're seen much more in a more positive light, more described as vulnerable, deserving of help, rather than, for example, some of the security economic concerns that were very prominent in the media in 2015. Studies have also shown that individuals are much more likely to engage in sort of pro-social behavior, more likely to want to help Ukrainian nationals because of this European identification. So kind of perceiving them as one of us or similar to us, as being white, as being close to the kind of European identity. And that's associated with empathy and helping intentions. And this idea, again, perception of deservingness, and how media frames and how public perceive migrants or refugees really does matter. So we know from previous studies, for example, that if a person is described as a refugee, they're more likely to be seen as deserving. If someone is described as an asylum seeker, they're more likely to be seen as exploiting the state, or kind of economic concerns start to arise, even though all refugees would have had to have been asylum seekers in the first place, because it's just a different legal terminology. So on the other hand, instead of discrimination, perhaps there's greater solidarity with Ukrainian refugees. So the current experiment looks at, I'm specifically going to more focus on refugees today, but it looks at refugees and migrants. And I particularly want to look at, first of all, is there discrimination towards Ukrainians? And does refugee status elicit solidarity? So it's using the same sort of correspondence testing, but this time ethnicity is indicated not only by name, but also in the email itself. So the reason that's included is because the person states in the email whether they came to Ireland first as a refugee, or if they came to Ireland 10 years ago trying to signal their migrant status. And this, they're applying for new ads in the entirety of the Republic of Ireland, by choice and by, I suppose, being forced in a way. And so I did want to originally look at regional differences to see where there are differences between Dublin and outside of Dublin. But with the lack of accommodation, it kind of became not necessarily a choice that I made, but something that's kind of necessary in order to avoid detection by the prospective landlords. They're paired applications, so instead of 3 applicants applying to the same, this time it's only 2. That's to avoid, again, detection. So, for example, it could be quite suspicious if two applicants with refugee status apply to the same landlord. The ethnicity that I'm using, so Irish nationals is my kind of control group, Ukrainian migrants and Ukrainian refugees, as I said, but today I'm just going to focus on refugees. And I'm comparing Ukrainian refugees to Nigerian refugees, so people who would have come perhaps through the direct provision system, but now would have, exited that and looking for accommodation. And then also comparing Ukrainian migrants to Polish migrants to kind of compare that sort of this idea that this European identity somehow gives some extra protection. And the emails, again, are equivalent but not identical. And is there anything else to say about that? That's kind of the gist, really, of the experiment. So this is the procedure similar to the last experiment. So again, following what's been done in previous experiments, random assignment on order of application. There's time delay between emails, generally between 30 minutes and an hour. Recording if response is received and the type of response, so whether you're invited to view an apartment, what type of invitation is it open viewing, is it not, and if any information is requested, and then promptly declining invitations to attend a viewing to kind of obviously ethically, because there are obviously ethical concerns, to minimize inconvenience to prospective landlords. So moving on to some very preliminary findings, these grey bars here indicate responses to emails. So all the Irish applicants, all the emails that were sent down by Irish applicants, 49% resulted in a response. In the case of the Ukrainians, this was 29%, and in the case of the Nigerians, 23%. So in comparison to the previous experiment, it is much harder to get a response to an email now than it was back in 2018. But of course, response to an email does not necessarily mean you're going to be invited to view an apartment. This could be thank you for your email, but the accommodation's already gone. So really trying to focus more on invitations to view an apartment. So from all the emails sent by Irish applicants, only 33% resulted in invitations to view. In the case of the Ukrainian refugees, this was 16%, and in the case of the Nigerian refugees, this was 13%. So again, if you kind of try to imagine yourself, say put yourself in the shoes of these fictitious applicants, if you are looking for accommodation, if only 16% of all the emails you send result in invitation to view an apartment, it is quite a bad situation in the sense that that invitation to view does not necessarily mean you will get the apartment. You could be invited to an open viewing with hundreds of other people. If we look at the logistic regression, so this is controlling for time, order, application template, gender, employment, location, family size, accommodation type, and landlord type. The odds for Nigerian refugees in comparison to Irish applicants decreased by 71% to receive an email in response to their email, and for Ukrainian refugees, they decreased by 63%. If we look at invitation, so not just a response, but actual invitation to view, in the case of the Nigerian refugees, in contrast to Irish applicants, the odds decreased by 69%, and for Ukrainian refugees, they decreased by 66%. And you probably, without even having to do any statistical analysis, you can probably tell that these differences are not, the difference between the two groups are not too different. So while you can see that there is ethnic discrimination in the Irish market, Ukrainian refugees do not seem to benefit from this kind of European identity. They're discriminated, again, to a slightly lesser extent, but that is not statistically significant. The black bars here represent the previous experiment, so I just wanted to compare. So Nigerian migrants from 2018 experiment were 54% less likely to be invited to view an apartment in comparison to Irish applicants. In this experiment, Nigerian refugees are 69% less likely to be invited to view an apartment. And again, it's important to stress that in all these emails, the applicants are stating that they have previous landlord references, that they have employment references, so they are signaling that they're able to pay the rent and that they're not in a situation where they wouldn't be able to, pay the rent. So that should minimize discrimination, but obviously that doesn't. Obviously, the Ukrainian refugee comparison to Polish migrants isn't a great comparison because they are different groups, and I will have data to compare Ukrainian migrants to Polish migrants, which I think will be obviously more accurate. But I still think it's interesting to note that in the case of Ukrainian refugees, they are 66% less likely to be invited to view an apartment in comparison to Irish nationals, where the percentage in 2018 for Polish migrants was 24%. So obviously quite a difference. Some of the other preliminary results as well. I haven't had a chance to analyse the full data set, so some of these are very preliminary, but so far gender doesn't seem to play a role. So females, yes, they are more likely to receive an invitation to view an apartment, but this is not statistically significant. So unlike we saw in the 2018 experiment, where from the very start it was very obvious that females were more likely to be invited to view an apartment. Similarly to 2018 experiment, individual landlords are more likely to discriminate than estate agents, but this only applies to response to emails only. So in other words, if the response to email includes invitation to view, there isn't a difference between estate agents and landlords, but in terms of to receive just an email back, individual landlords are less likely to do that. There seems to be greater levels of discrimination in the Greater Dublin area, but again, not statistically significant. And as I already mentioned, no statistically significant differences between the two ethnic groups. So Ukrainian refugees do not seem to benefit from this kind of solidarity or European identity. In terms of some of the other, I suppose, things that are emerging from the current experiment is that, once again, Irish applicants are asked to provide less information. So this relates to, for example, being immediately invited to viewing, whereas the ethnic minority applicants might be asked to provide documents before they are invited to viewing. Refugees are also more likely to be invited when emails are generic, which sometimes kind of makes me sort of wonder, is someone actually even reading the emails, in the sense that the emails that where invitations are issued to both Irish applicant and ethnic minority applicants tend to be kind of generic email that you'd imagine the landlord or estate agent sends to everyone. It's just like, there's no specifics in it, it's just very generic. It's like, open viewing at this time, bring all the documents type of thing. Whereas more individualized emails tend to be much more likely to be sent to Irish applicants. And again, like the previous experiment, can't stress this enough, that this is literally the first step. So being invited to view an apartment does not mean you will be successful in securing the apartment. So it's the very, very first step that someone needs to be able to get over. It's kind of the first barrier before they can actually, be successful in securing accommodation. Some of the implications are, so we see that ethnic discrimination is not only prevalent, but actually seems to have gotten worse in the Irish market. From a policy perspective, I think it's very important to note that international protection applicants are particularly vulnerable. As the focus was, let's say, specifically on Ukrainian refugees, and I included more Nigerian refugees to compare to the previous experiment, but I think it's really important to note the difficulties that people might face if they're transitioning from direct provision system, and that's really, I think, important to note. There seems to be perhaps certain stereotypes attached when people apply and they state in their email that they're a refugee, and that is particularly important, I think, to note. European identity does not seem to protect Ukrainian refugees from discrimination, but as I said, my further investigation is to compare the refugee and migrant status. I'm specifically going to compare Ukrainian nationals who came, let's say, in the email state, they came to Ireland 10 years ago, so kind of trying to signal the migrant status and see, does that play a role, to try to see how much of this kind of penalties associated with this, with the refugee in terms of applying for accommodation. But that's the end of the presentation. Thanks very much.